Okay, cool. Welcome everybody to this session that we're going to have for the Better Work Together online global gathering. My name is Kate Beecroft and I work on decentralizing governance and DAO design at a blockchain startup called Centrifuge. I'm part of Enspiral and was very fortunate to learn many of my approaches, practices, and mindsets about the work I do there. With this bunch of people sitting here with me, Enspiral was really a life-changing experience for me, and I'll always be extremely grateful and ever curious about how this pack of stray dogs designed and were part of something so rare and significant that it continues to kind of flow out into the world, inspiring and catalyzing action. So today we're going to talk a bit more about the dry, processy stuff, which many people love, namely the minimum viable board, an experiment in distributed governance that was really important in the evolution of the network. So we're going to ask, how did this work? What did this board actually do? What did it enable? We're here to participate in a conversation with past and present members of the Enspiral Foundation board and learn about minimum viable governance and how to manage legal compliance, risk, and duties, directors' duties to safety, while effectively decentralizing governance and control. If you have questions as we go, pop them into the chat, and I do hope we'll have plenty of time for interaction at the end as well. So first up, I'm going to introduce our lovely panelists, and panelists, feel free to tag anything you want on to the end if you want our audience to know that, or when you start talking in the panel. Let's begin with Joshua. Joshua started Enspiral in 2011, and Enspiral Dev Academy a few years later. I really treasure Josh for his kind of ninja way of seeing the world and all its many problems and potential solutions to those problems, and yet being able to quietly bring people in. Whoever has energy for the ride, he'll bring them in. And I would say he really changes lives. Alanna Irving was a very early member and key figure in getting things done in the Enspiral network, something that she takes with her in whatever she does. I would really recommend checking out her full circle leadership work. It's absolutely fantastic. And I think, yeah, it's still circulating, Alanna, I can tell you that. Susan Basterfield, what a pocket rocket of love. Greater than partner and author of many, many books. She is always evolving and spreading. We've traveled all over the world together, exploring new ways of working with so many people. And I would say so many lols. Silvia Zuur, the best listener you will ever meet. This is a woman with a plan, even if there's crazy conditions along the way. And PwC are now extremely lucky to have her executing plans, and she will execute. Richard Bartlett, co-founder of the Hum and human of minor but significant Twitter fame in certain circles. Rich is your go-to guy for circle soundbites. He just always knows the perfect thing to say that will reach in and grab at the heart and the trust and the sharing of a big circle of people and bring them all together. And finally, Ants Cabraal, unstoppable fountain of energy. He's always there making things happen, dreaming big, whiteboarding, and just giving out a whole lot of positivity and energy. So these are our panelists. So let's jump into our topic for today, and then I'll start asking a few questions. Anyone want to add something, panelists, that I missed? You're fine? So Enspiral's vision was always to distribute vision, strategy, and leadership as widely as possible. But as a group of people undertaking business activities, it needed a formal legal entity And of course, legal entities respond to regulatory requirements. Enspiral registered as a New Zealand company, and thus the Enspiral Foundation had to have directors to comply with the law. Now, on the New Zealand Institute of Directors website, it describes a board as a group of people who can debate the difficult issues and come out with a clear direction for a future or the future of a company. So how did a sprawling network of people who had assembled to do something completely out of the ordinary, that with values that imagined a whole new way of working and relating, one that involved very little hierarchy and a lot of partnership and a lot of autonomy, how did they have a board of directors? And how was that board able to work to escape the explicit and the implicit pressures to stop hippieing around and to get the rest of the network in line? So the point of this panel is to investigate this experiment in distributing governance, and the hope that it can continue to contribute to a long series of experiments around governance that are happening all over the world and have been happening for a very long time. So let's get going with some questions. Just to start off with a bit of a high-level description, Joshua and anyone else, can you give us your short high-level description of Enspiral, the mission and the values?
Enspiral then or now?
I would start off with Enspiral then, please.
I think so. When we started the board, we were about a year into Enspiral. The first year was kind of fluid, the 2010, and 2011 was when we formally started the Enspiral Foundation. We started a legal entity, needed a board. And so I'd say the Enspiral then was along the lines of, there's a trickle of human energy going into the biggest problems of our times. How do the purpose of Enspiral is just to make that a river. How do we just have more people spend their careers working on stuff which they want to work on and cause the impact they want to have? The heart of that was very much a livelihood experiment. How can you get paid to spend your time working on the stuff that's most important? Because you kind of have limited capacity if you can't get paid to do that. So that was sort of front and center in Enspiral. I'd say the second thing was very much around the emergence of rich information systems. Kind of felt like it opened a new possibility space for organizing differently, so that instead of having command and control hierarchies and whatnot, how do you use information systems to have emergence and collaboration and decentralization and so on? So how do you organize in a very decentralized way? And lots of experiments in doing that in many ways. And the third one was very much around using the tools of business to make a change. And that really tied in with the livelihood strategy as well. So that was kind of the vibe of Enspiral in those days. Those were the three things that were important. We just kept bumping into people who really wanted to have more meaning in their work, and they wanted to figure out how to earn a livelihood making the difference they wanted. And so out of that, we were doing lots of things. We were starting companies. We had a freelancers cooperative, and we kind of started the Enspiral Foundation Limited, so a limited liability company in New Zealand, to be the legal avatar for the network as a whole. So it was the thing which owned the Enspiral brand. It was the thing which had our money, which everyone put in the middle. It was the legal entity that represented the network as a whole. And I think the thing for me about how that tied into the minimum viable board was this idea of the foundation was the legal avatar of the network. It wasn't the network. And in my head, it was always a chess piece on the board, which could have a bank account and could sign contracts and could hire people and have a credit card, etc. And one of the big framings of the MVB was like, steward that entity. Make sure it's not bankrupt. Make sure it's not breaking any laws. But you're not here to direct the network. You're not here to govern the network. You are here to steward this legal entity. And so I think that in my head, that separation between the network as a whole and this legal entity was one of the key starting points for setting up the MVB experiment.
Great, thank you. Great intro. So I wanted a bit more detail on the minimum viable board, and especially this cool name. Does anyone, maybe Alanna, you could step in and just give us a bit more detail into where it came from, adding on to what Joshua said and what it started to do.
I'm just realizing I should have gone back and read all of my notes from that time, because it's like, how did this? Was this part of the refactor? It was part of the refactor, wasn't it? Okay. So obviously Enspiral went through many evolutions and reimaginations and stages and stuff like that. And one of them was this thing called the Enspiral refactor. I guess these things happened when we'd kind of outgrown old structures, kind of like, I don't know, when a creature like outgrows its carapace and it's like always a bit messy and just shedding stuff, and what's it going to shape is it going to be? So this was a moment like that. I think the people who had been on the board up to that point were feeling pretty stressed out. I was feeling stressed out. I've been on the board for a long time at that point. I guess just as I had learned, like, oh, what am I actually responsible for as the director of this company? It kind of started to dawn on me that maybe I didn't have the tools or the structures to like do that job well, because we had already kind of said no to a lot of the very traditional ways that gets done, which is usually there's a board appoints an executive appoints staff, board sets like strategy and some very kind of like high level like risk and policy and stuff like that, and then holds the executive accountable. We did not have an executive. So I was sitting there going, what is a board if we don't have an executive? Like, what good is it for me to sit over here and have all these conversations and do all this thinking, come up with like very deeply thought through views on boardy stuff, but there's nothing, where does that go? What do I do with that? And having an executive was never going to be the answer for Enspiral. So I think as we were going through the refactor and thinking about lots of different things, that's where this idea came out, that actually we should, like we did so many times at Enspiral, like look at this thing called governance and ask ourselves, like, what actually is it? Like, where does it come from? Like, what, not just like, what are the boxes we have to tick, but like, why are those boxes there? What are these laws supposed to be for anyway? And then can we boil it down to its essential nature and throw out the parts that are not that essential nature and kind of reconstruct what we need to? And I guess it was also an attractive challenge, because we're like software people. Most Enspiral people are software people or next to software people. And so this idea of a minimum viable product comes from software development, where you're asking yourself, what is the cheapest, quickest, easiest way we can build something to get something into the real world and start testing our assumptions and see how it works, out of a belief that you really don't know until you try an experiment. So kind of apply this concept to governance, and thought, okay, if we can get the boil it down to the smallest, most minimal viable thing it can be, then maybe we can understand what it really needs to be and build it up from there. That's my recollection. I'm sure other people have different views on it.
Yeah, I was surprised at the 2015 date. I was like, wasn't it earlier than that? But no, thanks for writing all the blogs, everyone. I think that for me, I think the vibe of like a minimum viable board was there before the 2015 time. And that's when I think it got really encapsulated in the name. And that's also when I remember that phrase of just like, we're here to keep it legal and here to keep it solvent, was like the mission that I think got instilled in the board a bit clearer. Before then, I think it was a little bit more of, you're here to steward this entity. But it was, yeah, I think the minimum viable was reflecting something that was already there in a very concise way.
Okay, interesting. So we're creating a bit of a timeline here. I just want to jump back a second, because I think this question comes up often amongst people who are interested in the minimum viable board. And, you know, why is there a board? Or going down a level, why did Enspiral opt for a limited liability company rather than a cooperative structure or an NGO, which have a bit more scope inbuilt for decentralized decision making? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
I can answer that one, because it was my job to be doing all that like legal research when we were asking all of these questions. And like, we started a company because it's the easiest kind of legal structure to start. It's the cheapest, it's the quickest. And so that's where we started. But we did ask ourselves, like, well, should Enspiral Foundation be a charity? Because it had very, you know, obviously it's all of its goals were around social impact and stuff, and it was adjacent to the charity space. But we looked into it and we're basically like, that's very restrictive. Being a charity is quite restrictive. You have to declare very specifically what your purpose is. And we really wanted this thing to be broad, I would say, and flexible, and that's not really what charity is about. It would have probably helped with some tax stuff, but we looked at it and we're like, I don't know, legals seem complicated. We looked at cooperative. When you're a cooperative, we were basically running like a cooperative, but when you're an actual cooperative, there's a lot of paperwork every time somebody comes and goes. And literally so much of what we were doing then was just trying to do things efficiently and not get caught up in the heavy structures of the way things tend to be done. But functionally, we really were running, it was a company, limited liability with a charitable constitution. So our charitable nature was in our constitution. It was run as a not-for-profit, and that was constitutionally, adhered to. And we were functionally run as a nonprofit, functionally run as a cooperative in many ways. But a lot of it was about just avoiding bureaucracy, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you for that bit of backstory. So let's keep moving with this idea that Enspiral is very much an organization or an organism that evolves and goes through phases. And governance is a function that evolves with the needs of any organization. As Enspiral evolved, undoubtedly, we've already heard about how the needs of the board evolved into the minimum viable board. So how did the minimum viable board also change? Can we get a bit of a sense of the evolutionary patterns of the minimum viable board from 2015? Maybe Silvia or Rich, you want to tackle this one. How did you see the board evolving?
Well, I can jump in and then hand it over to Rich. I think it was an awesome conversation from Josh and Alanna so far in terms of the history. And I think the two key things that I wanted to sort of point out is we were making stuff up within the boundaries of what already existed. And I think that was one of the geniuses of it. I think Alanna touched on it, but if you think about it, it was called an Enspiral Foundation, but it was a limited liability company with a charitable constitution, with non-financial shares, with members. So those are all things that existed, but we kind of took those structures and made them work for us. And I just think there's a magic in there that shouldn't be, passed over too fast. I think I also like that question, Kate, in terms of the evolution. I guess what I witnessed is sort of when I joined in Enspiral in some of those early days is the board was figuring it out. And like Josh said, it was just kind of names on paper. But I would really shout out, I think it was Josh Ford and Anneke Goodall and Viv Maderborn as key people who really brought some of the founding sort of governance in that early stage, and they definitely helped. They played a key role in that sort of early iteration, and I think their names should definitely be mentioned in this constellation. And then I think also that refactor moment. I mean, I think many people on this call right now are probably in all different evolutions of organizations, right? In that early sitting around the table through to the like, holy shit, how do we get out of this thing? And I think there's those moments when you just go, oh my gosh, something needs to change. And I think that was that refactor moment. So I think in terms of the evolution, and I think definitely that's where I sort of look at Alanna and some of the conversations that we had at that point of going, what do we do with this thing? And perhaps we were slightly overzealous in terms of feeling over responsibility. But again, when you build these networks, everyone feels responsibilities for different parts. Other people were feeling responsibilities for the decision making, for the finances. And I think I have a personality trait, and I think Alanna had that as well, that was feeling responsibility for some of the board parts. And so I think there was just that refactor moment, was that recognition that it wasn't working. And I think also in this conversation, it's really important acknowledging the shit that worked and then acknowledging the stuff that didn't work. And that time it was burning people out. There were tears. There were lots of things that weren't working. And so I think a lot of the MVB was a response to that. And in some way, that's where I really love now how it's evolved further, and how almost that language has now made it, when I look at the folk that are on it, and that's where it would now probably be great to hear from Rich, in terms of my hope at that point is it would be big enough in structure to be able to hold what it needs to hold, but small enough in form that it wouldn't feel like it's a weight. And I think we didn't have that balance right in the early days. And my hope is that right now, that weight and that form and that structure feels about right.
I appreciate your wishful thinking, Sil.
Oh, God damn it.
And by that, I mean, I think there's a few sort of design principles that probably Joshua showed up with and then recruited other people, and then they brought their own versions of these design principles. And we've got, it's not clearly articulated anywhere, but some implicit set of like, this is how we design the organization. And one of those principles, I think, is we want this network to feel like a living organism, which means it goes through its own growth stages. And every time we do an update, like a refactor, every time we rebuild the structure, we know that it's like our best guess for what the next stage needs, but it's immediately out of date. And there's always a kind of imperfect fit between the formal structure and the informal reality of what the group, what state it's in, and now it feels like what states the group are in, that the group has become polycentric in a way where there's different characters that are at different levels of maturity, like some new groups that are just forming and some that are really old and like more in like an eldership role and so on. I think another principle that was in there from the early days is this attitude of like, if the leadership and the energy and the ideas and the enthusiasm is not coming from the network, it shouldn't exist. Like Joshua is someone who brings a lot of enthusiasm and vision and energy, but if it's just one person in the middle that's saying, hey, let's go, this is the plan, let's everyone it's like, that's not us. That's not us. That happens at the smaller scale in specific ventures and projects and so on. But at the level of the network, I think we all sort of agreed, if there's not sufficient leadership coming from different directions, then there's no point us being, this network shouldn't exist. And so that means the network as a whole is not necessarily very efficient or coherent or accessible or easy to understand, or it's not like it's got these measurable goals and it's ticking them off one by one. Like, if that's what you're trying to do, then probably don't copy this structure. But what this structure does enable is an enormous amount of leadership development opportunities and an enormous percentage of the people who feel a real sense of ownership. And that's very hard. That's very hard to duplicate. When you were asking about patterns, Kate, I went through we keep our minutes in a spreadsheet because we're very futuristic. And I went through the minutes of the last couple of years of board meetings, and the recurring pattern is check in with the such and such working group, check in with the brand working group, check in with the retreats working group, check in with the comms working group. It's just like, our job is to notice, hey, something feels like it's falling to pieces, or maybe not falling to pieces, but it's a little bit wobbly. It's not our job to fix it, but we are tapping on shoulders and saying, hey, is there someone on this? Is this under control? Have you, do you need us to use our position where we've got the ability to rally people's attention? Do we need to put attention on you and rally some new volunteers or something? Or like, have we reached a break point between our formal structures and our informal structures, and we need to like draw people's attention to that and have a fresh renegotiation of like what the rules are? But there's very little of us actually executing on anything. Like Alanna said, there's no executive team, so so we can't. At some point, Kate, I would love to talk about the next stage of evolution too, but I'm not sure where that fits in the flow that you have in mind.
Let's fit it in the flow. What I'm going to do is pass to Susan and Ants to give their 2 cents. And then if you want to take it back, Rich, and talk about the current flow, that would be great. And it was really good to hear from you, Rich, a bit, some of these practical aspects of what the board was doing, like these shoulder tapping. I think that's really useful for our audience, just as a note to our list. Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like kind of to take it back to the first iteration of the MVB on which Silvia sat, along with Billy Matheson and Rob Guthrie. I think it was the 3 of you initially, wasn't it? When it was officially became the MVB. There were some tensions and frustrations, I think, at really understanding what the minimum viable board was. And I feel like it wasn't until the next iteration, which myself, Ants, Rob, and Bart de Vries were part of, that we really landed on this like 2-part purpose, which is keeping Enspiral legally compliant and keeping us financially viable. And really, I can remember in many of those early meetings, us constantly checking in with each other that are we coming to this agenda item or this particular issue with our member hat on, or with our contributor hat on, or with our venture hat on, and really having to pull ourselves back continually to this very specific role of MVB. And so that was really helpful in keeping us super focused. But I'd love, Ants, to hear from you, because one of the, at least the way that I remember it, one of the reasons why this frustration and burnout that Silvia mentioned was happening was because of the frustration of trying to figure out who actually is doing strategy, right? Who is actually worried about the fact that we've just ended this big contract, or the funds from this grant are running out, and we need to figure out a way to keep this Enspiral thingy financially viable. And I'd love for you to talk about how you felt stepping into this and taking on this very key role that did allow us to become financially stable for the next sort of 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah, cool. Happy to. I think one of the things that, just listening to the reflections was a good reminder for me. This idea of like minimal viable board was definitely like an aspirational idea. Aspirational in the sense like maybe one day it'll be minimal viable for quite a while. And when I stepped on, I'm like the last sort of personality type that you would want doing governance. I didn't want to be on the board at all. But when I stepped in, one of the things that was gifted to me in that role is that the people who came before me, so particularly I think it was like in Silvia's cohort of people on the board and before that, is they cleaned it up because it didn't really do anything. For many years, when we didn't know where like a contract was supposed to live, or someone had to run an event and then all of a sudden it needed to be run somewhere, it would default to our legal avatar, Enspiral Foundation, running it. And the result of that was it was really messy. And it was like, wait, what are we actually responsible for in this thing? And so a big part of the minimal viable was like was pushing stuff out. It was ending contracts. It was actually setting up other companies to hold different contracts so that the whole network understood that the only thing that Enspiral Foundation had to do was run a very, very simple business model, which was our membership model, which was like everyone chips in a bit of money, and that money needs to pay for the very, very core expenses that keep the whole thing alive. And it wasn't much. It was things like running our software systems and paying a tiny little amount to a crew to run our admin. And it was only when we had sight of that we could genuinely be minimal viable, because then we had nothing to worry about. And we pushed all the hard problems into other places, either other companies that needed to be run in other parts of the system. So that's something that I was just thinking about then. I was like, oh yeah, actually, that's why the job was easy. Because by the time I showed up, all we had to do was make sure that we had a business model called coffee, beer, and pizza, which meant people contributed the monetary equivalent of a coffee, beer, or a pizza each week. So all we had to do at that point was make sure there was enough coffee, beer, and pizza money to pay for our $2,000 a month or whatever it was. And then we could sort of just go to the pub and finish the meeting there, and it was like no problem.
I just want to jump in there because there are two really great reflections, Susan and Ants, and so I was about to say almost similar thing after Susan's reflection, and the way I was going to say it is I feel like when it went through that transition from being a board to the minimal viable board, it had an identity crisis. And I think that was that challenge or that crisis that it was focusing is it was trying to do too much. And you two both just put it really eloquently, and to be honest, a way that I haven't reflected it. To hear that clear purpose, Susan, made real sense, because if I think about the time just before that clear purpose, and I think coming back to that question that you were asking, Kate, to be real practical, I guess those of you who are thinking about core boards or MVBs in your structure, like what is the core purpose? Because pre having those two statements that Susan just described, like the board had, we said yes to a massive government contract. And that was a cluster of a situation. Like, there was no accountability. There was like suddenly we had an annual reporting cycle and all of these things. Or I think Ants and I ran 2 or 3 different events through the Enspiral Foundation, which in retrospect, like that is not what it was there for. But at the same time, we were also opportunistic building this thing. And I think those two purpose statements that Susan just said, we didn't have the maturity or the language to name them. So it wasn't that it was a wrong thing, it was just the evolution. And it's really awesome to hear that clarity now.
Wonderful. I want to get back to this idea of learning to be a board member. But before we do that, Richard, did you want to talk about the phase we're in now?
Yes, thank you. I've got, for the first time in my life, I've got a slide to share. And I'll also, it's attached to a document, so I'll share the document after I explain it. But this is a very simplified diagram of what we call the old way, where we have, so the members are the people who know each other very well and trust each other a lot and are the legal shareholders of the Enspiral Foundation. And they delegate some of their authority to the directors of the Minimal Viable Board. And the main thing that members is doing are inviting new contributors into the network. And when I say we're trying to decentralize leadership and authority and innovation out to the edge of the network, it means as much as possible, we want the contributors to be leading on stuff. Any kind of governance question, any kind of how are we going to spend our collective funds, the contributors get to not just participate, but to lead on those things. They can bring proposals and say, I want to spend money in such and such way. And like people have said, the MVB here is just like making sure that is some legal enough. And the good thing about having the central core of members is that because only members can invite contributors and because members know each other very well and trust each other a lot, it means that every person in the network is only kind of like one step away from every other person in the network. There's always like, we've always got a trusted friend in common. And so that's maintained a really high density of, it's created a core level of coherence, despite all the constant changes and the subjectivity and the complexities. At least we've got a sense of like, I know you and you know me. The downside of this model is that this level of trust required to join that member circle only really works when people can spend a lot of time together physically in person. And as we have become more hybrid and more decentralized geographically, it's just almost impossible for new members to join. And so we've finally approved a new model that has been cooking for probably 5 years, but now it's really mature and ripe, which is what we call the node model. And so there's no central group of members anymore. Everyone's a member. And we have these different nodes, and some of them are geographic. So the first node that we approved is the Enspiral Europe node, and I've been helping to sort of steward that group, and it has its own decision-making agreements, its own policies, its own financial infrastructure. So we're no longer, the people that are members of the Enspiral Europe node are no longer sending their membership fees to the Enspiral Foundation in New Zealand. We are keeping our funds using Open Collective, which has been co-created partially from Alanna and others that are on this call. So we've got an opportunity to have some autonomy. And then there are other nodes forming. And so, for example, Joshua is starting one that's called the Web3 node. So it's experimenting with new decentralized technologies. So it's not so geographically focused, it's more thematic. And so now the role of the board, it's not minimum anymore. It's actually, it's one of the only things that provides continuity between these distinct nodes. So we don't actually know, this is only just getting started, so we don't know what the board is going to grow into. But my sense is it's got more weight on it, or it's coming that it's going to have more weight on it. We might find that there are sort of delegates from each node that get together as a sort of like council of advisors, or that we have to negotiate as these nodes mature in these different communities with different identities and different ways of doing things. We might have to send delegates to get together and say, yeah, but what's the minimum viable consensus? Like, what's the stuff that we need to agree on? And that's sort of like the next chapter that we don't know what's going to happen yet.
Can I ask, Rich, what happens if there's 40 nodes? How does that scale? Because that's one of the questions I was thinking of, like, what are some of the challenges of this model? And for me, a lot of it is around scale. And so I really love seeing that picture, but I straight away see that if you imagine the version of that, okay, do we need to have 5 boards with 5 nodes attached to each one? How do you see that working?
I mean, personally, it's one of the most important dimensions of organizational design in my work is putting in the right boundaries at the right levels of scale. And so, like I did in my lightning talk this morning, getting people into groups of 4 or 5 or 6, like that's where productivity happens and that's where closeness happens. But if you want to do something ambitious, you need more than 5 people. You might need 5 groups of 5, and there's a bigger boundary on that. And what we're doing with these nodes is I can imagine each node, a lot of them will probably be in the range of like 50 people, maybe 60, 70 people. And so that's like a bigger boundary that holds smaller subgroups inside of it. And the network is this bigger one. And we might find that we have to as we mature, like if there were 40 nodes, we might find that actually we need to add more boundaries, and more like, okay, there's these 10 nodes that have something in common and these other 10 that have something else in common. And, or we might say, no, it's time to decouple and not have the same shared identity, but be cousins. And I mean, all of the people here that are no longer actively part of Enspiral, they're all part of our cousin networks, And so like, I think it's another, one of the founding principles that I think Joshua brought in was that it's not like we're trying to do the one true way of organizing, or that we need to consume the world into our big bubble. It's about creating connections between all of the bubbles that are already living in this new paradigm.
One version of a scalable thing is kind of what we're up to with Open Collective, which is I think why some things on Enspiral are having a good time with Open Collective, because it's never going to be a platform which can serve all the different things and all the diversity of the different things that Enspiral needs. But for a very specific niche, it's very helpful. Like Open Collective is like the scalable, like very clear, kind of professionalized version of an MVB, of like, what if you abstracted out all the legal governance stuff and all the stuff about having a legal entity and just all of that whole category in a super clear way over here, and then set up a service where a bunch of projects can use that as a resource. It has a proper board. Like, ironically, a bunch of the Open Collective things have very traditional boards because they have to be laser focused on all of that really traditional governance stuff, but they don't go outside of that. And like these structures can host, thousands of projects. Like, there's no way they could ever know what's even going on in most of those projects. So it's like inherently has to be decentralizable. And so I think like for me, the evolution in my own mind is clear of like, I was working on this thing in Enspiral, and then I went and did this kind of like version of it over here in Open Collective, which isn't it. And it is I would say highly scalable, because it very much does not rely on the super important things Richard just talked about transitive trust and human interrelationships, and it has none of that. It's like only the legals and the box ticking and the structures and the software that runs it all. And so I just think it's interesting that like different aspects of this are scalable and different aspects of it are very much not scalable, and that can be a really good thing and a very necessary thing.
Couple of thoughts.
Great.
One is on the Open Collective versus MVB side. I think Open Collective I view now as like, if you've got an organization which doesn't have a formal structure, you can get one very cheaply and very easily without having to start a foundation and invent a whole bunch of stuff. And there'll probably be some constraints on what that legal avatar can do, which is kind of the rules of Open Collective. And if you invest in getting your own foundation you set up, it'll be much more expensive, and you kind of have no limits on what you can do. But it's a different sort of thing, because right now it's like, maybe we don't have a foundation in a couple of years. Maybe everyone's just using Open Collective and that's all a node needs, because they don't need the weight and the unfettered access of the foundation and whatnot. The other one, and bouncing back to the Rich's comment there about the future there, I think one of the things when you mentioned that we mixed together all these things in a corporate form, which was unusual. I think that was Silvia or Alanna before. I think that was one of the big cultural things we had at our back at the beginning, was just like remixing internet culture. You just take lots of things, you put them together, see if they work, and this sort of patchwork approach. I think the other thing that really worked for us was just this startup culture of like, we're not trying to optimize for production, we're trying to optimize for learning. And so when you talk, Silvia, about, hey, what are we doing with 40? It's like, we have no idea. If we get to 40, we'll figure it out. What we're trying to figure out now is this a structure that we like and works for where we're at right now? And I think we're optimizing these node experiments and the future of the board to learn as quickly as we can in this space to see, does this fit our purpose? Is this something we do? And, everyone would have lots of ideas about, that'd be fun to try and solve for 40. But right now it's just like, let's optimize for our rate of learning. And I think that this ties back to that comment about MVBs, though the board is the only team still standing in Enspiral. Everything else has been started or dissolved at some stage in the last 12 years. And some of that's because we need one. Like, you can't really, unless you shut down the foundation, you must have the board. But I think it's also because it actually has been a functional, continual handing of the torch, where there's been new people welcomed in, it's evolved as the network has evolved, and everything else has kind of started or stopped. Like, we had catalysts and then we don't have catalysts. We're just getting rid of shareholders, or we're changing them significantly. We don't have members and contributors anymore. Lots of our key roles, which really served us for like 8 years, are going now. And I think that there's something really interesting about that, the board as the continuous lineage of Enspiral, and that it's when it that's sort of interesting me.
Yeah, it's quite weird as well, Josh, that you've come back on the board after all this time, right? I mean, I'm thinking about this question of scale and also Rich's question. Like, I personally can't see at this particular present point in time where a node would need to have a board, like a legal entity like a board. And I also think it's interesting. We haven't talked about really how the board, how the MVB has kind of shifted its purpose now that we're in this new land of nodes. And the way that I would describe our current role as the MVB right now is ensuring the efficacy of new nodes who are proposing themselves as part of the Enspiral network. And I'm wondering, JV, if you just want to talk a little bit about that and how natural that felt in terms of what you were just commenting on, that, you know, the MVB just seems to be this this constant in a ever-changing soup.
So Josh, if you have a quick answer for that, that would be great, because I want to bring us back to some of the practical questions we're receiving in the chat, and rather we're doing some good new future building for the nodes and the future of the network. But yeah, so take a minute to answer that if you can, Josh, and then we'll jump
Short
back.
version is, I think the MVB has been consistent because the foundation's been there and it needs a board. I think that if that hadn't been true, it probably would have been dissolved like everything else and something else started in its place. Gut feel, I haven't thought about it too much.
Okay, so we have a few just, I would say, practical questions that are coming up in our chat that I think we should address. One is that from Mark, which is, how do you make decisions in most of the cases? Mark, do you want to expand on what you mean? Or does someone want to?
I have a thought on that. So when we were talking before about like the board's job was sometimes to just push stuff out, push it out to who and push it out to where. And so we couldn't have had any sort of minimal viable anything if we didn't have Lumio, which was a tool that we used. Basically, I would say like the central nervous system of our whole organization. So when we were making decisions, what that meant was somebody would start a Lumio thread and run a Lumio process, which usually meant someone would develop a proposal. It would go around a couple of rounds of community feedback and iteration. They'd get advice, and then a formal proposal would be made and it would pass. And there'd be any number of people from the network involved in that process, usually a lot. And that was kind of the thing that replaced a bunch of board members sitting around in the room saying, we're going to do this, or this is what we're signing off on. And through that process of pushing stuff out, talking about it on Lumio, figuring out proposals, figuring out how to use Lumio, all this stuff. I think that was like a really important part of actually building the muscle to be able to do this work at all. I'm sure like Alanna and Rich, you guys have lots of insight on this because you were part of the team at the time, but like, I'll just leave that there.
Yeah, I think that it's quite a common understanding that Enspiral, after doing this for so long, that if you push responsibility into a void, it gets to the point where it boomerangs back to you if there are no structures set up in place to hold it. So for me, Enspiral operated with these very clearly defined levels of engagement to reduce the structurelessness, the idea being that pushing these decisions always outwards, they would land with the right group of people, with the right boundary. But I'd be interested in any examples of the MVB needing to do that and it not working, or like, how did that balance happen of the MVB pushing the decision out to the members circle, and then the members circle not necessarily pushing out, but trying to integrate contributors in? Did that always go according to plan?
I think this is why I got so deeply interested in the concept of leadership, development, because it's like how you get things not to boomerang straight back to you is developing the capacity of others to catch them and go off with them in their own direction. And now I'm sitting here thinking, like, what is that version of that for governance development and stuff like that? But anyway, I'm not answering your question. I would love to hear specific examples, and also, like, have we learned how to do that capacity development so that the things get thrown out and then pushed out and out and out instead of boomeranging back?
Yeah, I love that question. What is the leadership training or capacity development for governance? Richard, did you want to take a stab at this one?
Yeah, I'm fuzzy on the details, but something where it kind of didn't go well and we had to step in was in this transition of, we know that this old members model doesn't suit us anymore. We want to transition into this federated nodes model. Some people in the network had this voluntary enthusiasm, and they said, oh, we're going to put on an event which is going to formally close the members circle. It's going to be like a ritual of, the final farewell, the kind of salute. And of course, our first reaction is, oh, that's great that people are bringing this energy and they're going to make a useful contribution. And then we talked about it in the board meeting and looked at it a little bit more closely and said, wait a minute, this is premature. Like, we can't close the container that holds all of the formal responsibility until we know where it's going to go. And so we had to interrupt. We had to go like, hey, time to hit the brakes. This doesn't make any sense. If we're gonna like do a ritual closure, but then the legal responsibility is still sitting there, that sounds like a recipe for a disaster. So no, that doesn't work. We're going to have to change a new plan. That was a real case of, in case of emergency, break glass and get the enthusiasm of last resort. Like, we had to step in and do a bunch of hands-on work, a bunch more meetings than we're used to doing, and saying, yeah, we actually need another level of clarity, and formal proposals need to come up before it's time to close that circle.
That's the Enspiral way, right? Like the old proverb about don't remove a fence unless you know why someone put the fence up in the first place. Like the Enspiral way is like, get the shovels out, start digging up the fence, see who comes out screaming, see like what falls over when the fence comes down, realize that you have to put the fence back up, and then deeply understand how you build a fence, why fences are built, and like the nature of like concrete. And then like you have something. I just feel like that's not a bug, that's a feature.
I think it also
Definitely
goes into
a
the leadership
feature.
development path. Like, it's in terms of how do you build up a depth of capability for people to lead in ambiguous situations. You dig up lots of fences, and you build lots of stuff from scratch. Like, if you were learning a skill, you just do something from scratch to get a deep understanding of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been able to survive over, a bunch of tricky things, because there's probably like 4 or 5 network killer events we've dodged, I'd say, over the last decade. And if I think about the big things around like the refactor, the coffee, beer, pizza subscription model, the node stuff, like the member contributor model deeply failing, and let's refactor this thing live and keep it continuous, I kind of feel like all of them are described as network killing events where there's been some people who are canaries. And so I think, like, for example, when Enspiral, our financial model is not working, we're running out of money. The board was really good at noticing that and publishing, we're going to run out of money. This isn't going to work. And then it was Ants & Co. who stepped in and said, let's refactor our financial model and let's clearly move to this thing. And then we have a solvent organization on the backside of it. It was a long, painful process, but it was an individual and some people stepping up to solve it. And I think the same thing happened with the Enspiral nodes thing. Like, there's cultural risk here. The member contributor model will kill this network if we don't change it. So let's change it. And I think that's, each time we go through those things, I think leadership capability is developed.
I think that's why the fence thing works, because it's like, there's a lot of fences that are up in the world just because nobody's ever asked, does this fence really need to be here, or seen what happens if it's not there? Maybe it's not actually needed and this could just be open. And I just feel like sometimes not being afraid to experiment is a thing, and sometimes it's like, oh God, the whole thing's going to fall over, we've got to do something, and it's the urgency and everything. But what ends up happening is this like beautiful invention and evolution and all the stuff that's it's amazing, because you don't know what's coming and you don't know who's going to come out with it.
Or is this just a metaphor for digging up fences for the removal of all private property?
I'm okay with that.
Go out and remove it. I think we're circling around this really interesting topic of leadership development, because, I mean, usually when we think of boards, we summon up images of people in ties and power suits. who've done this many times before, right? Like they're a board person, they're professional, they sit on boards. But many of the Enspiral board and MVB had no experience. How did you get over this learning curve? How did you onboard new members? We've talked about it a bit, but were there any instances or people for you that really stood out in helping you onboard yourself?
I can throw a couple of ideas on that, Kate. I think for one, the stakes are relatively low. So it's a good place to learn, because Greater Than and Lumio and each of these different companies has their own financial and legal structure. They've got their own governance, they've got their own boards. So governing Enspiral as a network is actually pretty lightweight compared to governing a lot of companies. So it's a really good place to practice. And then the other thing I think we've done, and this is a general cultural pattern that we've learned, which is a kind of, it's like informal apprenticeships. Like you have someone who's someone who has a lot of expertise, usually has not very much spare time. And someone that has a lot of spare time probably doesn't have that much expertise. That seems to be the way things go. And so there's an informal matchmaking of who's someone that's showing up with enthusiasm and they're maybe a bit more junior, but they've got time, you know, and they've got this readiness to contribute, and they're ready to learn. They're in that right moment. Maybe they're in a career transition or something, you know, they're looking for a new development opportunity. And can we match them with someone who has a lot of context and a lot of experience, and make sure that in the board, for example, but in lots of different teams, that we have this kind of informal understudy relationship, and that after 6 months of doing the job alongside each other, a lot of skills gets transferred, and a lot of the unwritten rules and the implicit norms and the organizational knowledge gets transferred in that process. And so we've mentioned Vivian Maderborn and Billy Matheson. I mean, those are two characters for me who, they're probably the two people that I quote the most when I'm, you know, running trainings or something like that. They're just such profound wisdom, both in governance and community building and social enterprise, all these kind of fields that we're working in. And for me to have spent hours alongside them as peers is just the most extraordinary luxury. Like I feel like my education is so much more refined and valuable than anything that I ever accessed in university, because I had access to such experience, you know, not just experienced people, but they're so generous of spirit and so open-hearted, you know, that they would really get alongside me and create the context where it's safe to fail, and they can graciously deal with all of my immature arrogances. You know, like that's such an amazing contribution, and I think there's been a spirit of that has been sustained throughout the network. That, yeah, it's really important to do this. I mean, the phrase that I most remember from Silvia is, how do you leave without slamming the door? So like someone who's taken on a lot of responsibility at some point has to step out of that role and make sure that it's not in a state of distress or resignation or frustration, but actually they've set up other people to then lead in their own way.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And yeah.
We'll go to Ants and then we'll pass back to you, Susan. Okay.
Just one tiny little thing I'd add is because it's an abstract idea and you don't really get it till you're sitting in the chair, modeling is everything. Like just kind of, and I think that was really, really important that we never had wholesale changes of board members. We always had graduated evolutions. One person would drop off, one new person would come on. I think the biggest change we had was half the board changing at the same time, but there was a shadow period, and the modeling was everything. And it was interesting. One little thing I remember is the board before us would decide who was the chair of the board by playing rock, paper, scissors at the start of the meeting. And I remember that was one thing that we were like, nah, we're not doing that. That's terrible. Silvia, I think that was one of your things that we dropped. And so it was like the sense that you could, you know, you modeled stuff and then we owned and tweaked and changed little rituals over time.
Nice one. Susan, did you want to add your 2 cents there? Are you complete?
No, basically Ant said exactly what I was just going to say, as he does.
Of course. So I want to open it up in just a minute, just to see if anyone in the Zoom room wants to speak their questions or their voice. But just before we do that, Yeah, I've got two more questions. Quickly, Enspiral became known for helping birth distributed decision-making software like Lumio. Do you think the thinking behind any of this governance evolution board, minimum viable board, influenced the philosophy behind Lumio, or was it vice versa, or was it simultaneous? Alanna, Rich.
I think both Lumio and minimum viable board come from they're not from we need to make a thing that does how the thing is done in the world, but like more inherent essential needs of like, if we're starting from the very baseline of just like, okay, we're humans, we want to do a thing together, how do we need clarity, how do we get to clarity, it's like building up from the ground in a way. And so it makes sense to me that it would lead to something which is, I guess, quite useful to other people. I mean, I'm on multiple boards, and all of them you're using Lumio, because it's just like super useful no matter what kind of board you're on. And that's because it was just built in response to like very real, very immediate needs of collaborative decision making. It wasn't built for like, okay, let's go take a course at the Institute of Directors and go get an MBA to learn what governance means and then build software for that. It's not that. It's like, yeah. And I think that speaks to the point that's what we're making a moment ago about learn by doing, learn by apprenticing, learn by praxis. And and that's like a very kind of, I guess, deeply authentic way that human beings learn things. And it's how you learn something when you're learning something that's like real and emergent and is an art and is human and responsive. And it's not like you're trying to learn some giant system that's over there and has been codified apart from yourself. When you're trying to learn something you are a part of, this is kind of where you end up.
I want to add as well, Alanna, to that. You're pointing at something I think that's a really crucial kind of philosophical dimension. The thing I wanted to say is, in my opinion, I would doubt that Enspiral would have survived without Lumio, because Lumio reduces the cost of doing participatory network governance to a point where it's actually affordable. Whereas if we had to do all of our decision making through meetings, we probably would have run out of steam earlier, or we would have had to be quite a different organism. But and vice versa as well. I don't think Lumio would have survived to today if it weren't for the support of Enspiral. There's everyone on this call has made a meaningful contribution to Lumio, and that's the main value proposition of Enspiral, is that when times get tough, there are going to be talented, caring peers and friends and workers that are going to show up and help you get through the next struggle. So I see them as completely intercoupled.
Beautiful symbiosis. Claire, would you like to ask a question? Claire? Maybe she can't hear me.
Sure. Yeah, no, I can hear you. The question that I've got is when you talked about the cooperative model and you're not using the co-op model, I'm interested to know, with participatory democracy, and you talk about the nodes and you talk about members and the minimum viable board representing the members, how does the voting work in terms of that one member, one vote, which the co-op model has? How do you manage the voice in terms of that voting power? Sorry, that was the timer, the cooker timer going off in the background too.
I can speak to that a little. So, yeah, traditionally people think one member, one voice, one vote, meaning, okay, we're going to bring a proposal and we expect everyone to participate, and we're going to shape this proposal together. And we basically try to do that as little as possible in Enspiral. This is what I was pointing at by the phrase minimum viable consensus. That occasionally you're going to have to define a really crucial boundary in the system, like how do our roles work, or how does our money flow, things like that, where we really want to maximize participation. But generally what we're doing is trying to stimulate and catalyze where are the pockets of enthusiasm and energy and innovation, and like where's the new thing that's alive right now, where's the action, and how do we thicken it, like how do we stimulate it, how do we get around it and charge it up, and that looks not very much like consensus and much more like co-creation and emergence and spontaneity and sort of, yeah, like sometimes what that looks like getting around a new project means, okay, there's some legal considerations that, you know, you have people like board directors who will come in and give you some due diligence, but mostly we're trying to find the spirit of like a spirit of permission, that the permission is already there. Once you're part of the network, the expectation is this is a place where you're free to experiment within some broad parameters. You're not trying to get, and actually if you try to get people to agree with you, you'll find you meet a lot of resistance. Like don't wait for permission, you've already got it, go and do stuff. And that I think is distinctive in this network in a way. And I've met it in a few other networks, like in the network of Burning Man communities, for example, there's that sort of attitude as well. They call it do-ocracy. Like minimum stop and check, maximum like let's just try stuff. And the more cooperative decision making happens at the smaller scale.
Yeah, and I'd also just like to say, sorry, Kate, that there is no differentiation in decision making power between members, contributors, and directors. The only extraordinary power that directors have is to trigger an emergency decision making protocol. Other than that, the directors have no extraordinary powers, and nobody in the network ever had any more powerful decision-making rights than anybody else. And I think that that's quite unique and important to note.
Very good. I want to try a little experiment here by seeing if we can get all of our panelists to say something quite short and succinct, if possible, as a response to this question. What are the baseline requirements for a group that is trying to transition to the model of more distributed governance, moving from inner circle to bigger circle? Are there any like key words that you would rattle off?
Trust.
Trust. Ans.
Someone in the inner circle needs to be really good at synthesizing complexity and communicating it clearly to the outer circle.
Okay, great. Synthesizing complexity and communicating. Anyone else?
Believing before you can see.
Believing before you can see. Wonderful.
Tease apart all the things and don't couple things that don't have to be coupled.
Don't couple things that don't have to be coupled. Okay.
On that, try and identify small bounded spaces where you can experiment, and define the experiment and define the time that you're going to review the experiment, and then move in iterative steps at small scale, and try and avoid re-architecting the whole system if you can possibly get away with it.
Modularity.
Sorry, what was that, Alanna?
Just a word to link what I said and what Rich said would be modularity.
Modularity, very good. Joshua?
I think you need to get people to deeply care about the thing and deeply care about each other, and then create a controlled chaos and be ready to catch things when they fall.
Wow, I'm putting that on my to-do list. Create controlled chaos. Good one. Any last words? Or we'll move back to a question we had from the audience. Okay. Okay, that's the how-to list right there. So
hey, actually,
Edith,
Kate, can I say something about controlled chaos? Because it is very practical. So like in all Enspiral events, we use some variation of like open space technology or another way of getting all of the participants to create the agenda. And it's completely chaotic in the sense that you have all of these different people bringing ideas, and the ideas don't make sense. They don't add up. Or sometimes you've got two people that want to do the same thing, and it's a big mess. There's no like top-down polishing to make it all sensible, but it's very controlled in the sense that the definition, the outer boundaries of what's allowed here and how we're going to operate, that's really rigid and set in stone. And so like we do practices like that to give people that experience of like, there is discomfort and chaos, but there's also emergence and genius and intelligence as well. And you need to find that minimum firm line and the maximum fluidity.
That's what good governance feels like.
very nice. So we're coming towards the end of our time together. I just want to open it up to anyone in the audience that wants to speak their question. I saw one already from Eden. If you would like to speak your question. You're still on mute.
All right, yeah,
There
I
we
was
go.
just, hi. My question, which I wrote and now can't find, is, so how I'll remember it is interesting. I'm interested to hear more about like how explicit the pairings of like enthusiastic newcomer and time or elder kind of were or are in this governance practicing learnings, if possible.
My experience is very implicit, because one of the things that a lot of us have in common, not all of us, but definitely me, is a whole lot of like authority issues. And so if there's ever any suggestion that there might be a hierarchical power dynamic, I get really freaked out and really suspicious. And so a lot of these kinds of pairings have happened implicitly without, it's a way of like sidestepping people's authority triggers. Maybe others have had a different experience of it though.
It turns out if you sort of start a network with a vibe around decentralized organizing, you get a lot of people with what I'd call authority triggers. And you also get a lot of people who enjoy building org things. I think I agree with Rich about very implicit. There's a lovely idea in Māori culture around tuakana tēnā, around older sibling, younger sibling. And the thing that I found, and that's used a lot in education in New Zealand, and I think this describes how I've seen it work in Enspiral. And one of the things, the core ideas is that you might be much better at me at guitar and I follow you there. I might be much better at you at juggling and you follow me there. And the idea that these things are contextual and that they are not like positional. And so it's less about who is the person with more authority or experience I'm learning from always. And it's in this particular context, who knows more than I do? And how do we orientate around each other, around helping and supporting? And I find that dance is a delightful one.
I was just thinking when you said the word enthusiastic newbie, I think one of the challenges that we faced, I don't know if the others agree with this, but it feels like about 2000 and, or at least in my experience, 2015 or so, where Enspiral was becoming more and more sort of well-known, and you'd get these enthusiastic people join and expect that it was as per the blog that they'd read or this, and they'd be like, they'd think that it was this structured, like, all something, and they got burnt and spat out pretty fast when they realized that actually we were making this shit up. And so I think there was also that kind of like, you know, settle down, little grasshopper, actually come join us, dismantle this fence, what it all looks like. And so that sort of brand and awareness was definitely something that we had to try and counter and hold at the same time.
I think there are areas where the tuakana tēnā or buddy thing has become more explicit. Stewardship circles, you could kind of think of that way. There's definitely within nodes and ventures and other formats, there's lots of those things going on. So you might have like lots of those different relationships in different ways, where you would be like in your day job, you know, have this kind of relationship with that sort of thing, and then be someone's steward over here to the other side of the network, and then, you know, practice all these things in many ways. And I think with governance specifically, because it is so defined in a way, because it does stem from these very like explicit structures out there, that it kind of almost creates that opportunity to, you know, because it's like, it's clear when you've joined the board, for example, which is not the case for like most other things around Enspiral, stuff like that. So I don't know, it's an opportunity to look at it a little bit more explicitly. We did explore it, like we held an eldership retreat that one year, and like we were definitely conscious of these things coming up and asking ourselves questions about what do we do with new people, and what do we do with older people burning out, and how do we do institutional knowledge and all that kind of stuff. I think those questions are always floating.
Wonderful. I saw that someone had a question around tensions, and we have one from Irene. Mark, did you want to ask your question, whatever it was, around tensions?
Yeah, in my experience, shared values and same kind of passion for purpose doesn't mean you have a guarantee that there are no tensions. So tensions are something very natural in every organism. So you didn't talk a lot about I guess also in your organization, there were some tensions. How do you deal with them? Do you have a kind of process for it, or do you deal implicitly, like Richard said, or I would be interested in your experience.
I could jump in with one little thing in there. This has got nothing to do with tensions and everything to do with tensions, in that we used to have a multi-day retreat every 6 months. And it was this foundational heartbeat of spending time together, solving problems together, having great parties together, developing all of that stuff. And I reckon we stopped a lot of tensions before they started, and we resolved a lot of tensions through that process. I would never think of it as like a strategy in reducing tension, but it definitely did. Sorry, Sylv, you go.
Oh no, I was just going to give an answer that I was going to give to, I think, Kate's question around, like, when didn't it work? When did it boomerang back? And I think two of the key moments that I think about were interpersonal tensions, where there were opinions of certain groups that in two of the situations that people had acted inappropriately. You know, you get a bunch of humans together, and I know that was a moment when the board did need to step in because there was a fundamental conflict. And so I think that's also never easy, but it was definitely one of the, or two specific moments in my mind when it was like, oh, jeepers, we actually need to make a decision here because it could be a network breaking conflict, and how do you step through that? But I think considering that it was whatever it was, sort of 7 years of 300 people, how many relationships is that? In my mind, I only can think of two significant breakdowns. I think that's because of what Ants just said, through the retreat, through the care, and through all of those moments that we didn't actually have more.
So, Alanna, I'd love to jump over to what your comment on the chat. I don't know if it was related to this, but I do believe that facilitation is an important part of this as well in resolving tensions. Do you want to say anything on that? Do you agree?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think Enspiral's take on leadership and governance and all of this stuff is very much through the lens of facilitation, in terms of, you know, process-oriented, serving a group to do things together and communicate and function collectively. That's what it's all about. And facilitation is also, yeah, like a very practice-based skill with many different approaches to it that we all learn from each other, and we were all apprenticed to each other. So I think it really filters into the vision of governance as well. And of course, these skills are like governance, facilitation, risk management, mediation, like strategy, like these are all overlapping to some degree. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that. Like, if you're trying to minimalize your minimum viable board, like, do you separate it out from all that, or do you acknowledge those like interrelationships?
I want to say one more piece about tension and conflict. Building on what Ant said, I think we have emergently designed a system that tries to prevent conflict from arising, and does exceptionally well at that, by cultivating an extraordinarily high tolerance for difference, and by doing a lot of getting to know you, a lot of interpersonal trust building, and by devolving a lot of decision making into smaller autonomous subgroups. So difference is contained. Like, oh, you're the, you know, metaphorically, you're the vegan kitchen, you can have that house, and we're the meat eating kitchen, we'll go over here. And so we can peacefully coexist. But something that is a real regret of mine is that when tension and conflict has arisen, I don't think there's been a lot of instances where we haven't been very sophisticated in supporting people to get to a place of resolution and to learn the lessons. It's like we never quite had the maturity or the resourcing or the something necessary to be able to welcome in these really difficult, painful experiences and make sure that everyone is supported and the whole system gets to learn from them. And we've kind of trusted that that's happening at a smaller scale, and it has a lot of the time, but there have been some real ruptures that I think still sit on our hearts.
So interesting point around, we've talked a lot about the system learning and like learning together and learning from each other. And I would like to finish this panel just by asking each of you, what have you learned about yourself through this process of being on the board or the MVB or an Enspiral, if you want to go that big, in about 30 seconds or less? Susan, I'll start with you.
Sorry, I was hoping you weren't going to start with me. I'm going to take Joshua's favorite line, the line I use all the time. I have learned that it's possible to do work you love with people you love. And that the idea that in our lives and in our work and through our livelihood, we limit ourselves to believing that that's not possible is something that we've decided, that I had decided to make up, and have, through my relationship with Enspiral and all of the amazing humans, my life looks fundamentally different than it did 10 years ago. And that's because I've been practicing. I've learned to unlearn as well as relearn and be mentored and stewarded by a bunch of people that are young enough to be my kids. So that's one of the things I've learned.
Congrats. Anthony Cabraal.
I'm turning into a dog because we don't have much time left. I think the thing I've learned is when you're surrounded by people who are way smarter than you, you quickly understand and see what you're good at and also what your limitations are. And I've learned that when you are well supported, you can operate without fear, and then you can do lots of things like, run big events with people all over the world and turn into a dog and everything's fine.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anne. Silvia.
I've learned, and I'm still learning, that I bloody love these humans. I think in all honesty, though, I also learnt that I burnt out after 7 years of doing this work. And I guess I've also learnt that organisational structures is my work. And as Kate mentioned very briefly, I decided to jump into the belly of the alternative beast. And through that, I'm also really learning that a lot of the things that Rich described around a yes culture and innovation, all of those things, when you work in a capitalist, patriarchal, infinite growth space, it doesn't empower that. So I think what I'm learning at the moment, or my question, and I'd be curious really to have a follow-up conversation or hear from anyone, is how and where do these spaces combine? And how do you find the best of both worlds? Because I fundamentally sit here going, there's shadows and lights to both worlds, to the decentralized anarchist community care, yes driven, through to the other side. And I feel like the next phase of my journey is figuring out, how do you get sort of global impact? How do you get real scale? How do you get to the sort of government contracts that an organization like PwC can get, and also have the yes and the love and the care and everything else that we've described? Because as far as I can see on a global level, I don't see that at the moment. And I'm really curious about what that might look like. So if anyone has examples, hit me up. I'm on a 6-month sabbatical next year, so I've got lots of time to learn and look into it. And thank you all. This has been beautiful and a real nourishing conversation for my soul.
Thank you, Sylv. Alanna.
We create our world. We create our world. We make it up. We are making it all up all the time. We are not subject necessarily to the way things are out there. And that is both the most freeing and the most heavy thing in the world.
Beautiful. Thank you. Richard?
What I learned about myself, I need a minimum set of firm, explicit boundaries, and then an extraordinary amount of freedom and trust. And with the right conditions, I feel so abundantly full of love and generosity and courage and possibility and agency and intelligence, and not because of me. It's not living inside of me. It's in these specific relationships here that I just feel like I've got access to a superhuman, super organism capacities because of this way of connecting.
The thing in the circle. Beautiful. Thank you. Joshua?
I think I've got two main learnings at the moment. One about the world is that I kind of think that really good self-management looks just the same as really good hierarchical management. And I think that when you get good at both those things, I think it is indistinguishable. And so I really like the direction you were inquiring in, Silv, around that, because I feel like there is a space where they both touch the same thing, which is just exceptional working together. In terms of learning about myself, I've often described that I started Enspiral because I was lonely. Like I just wanted lots of cool people to do stuff with. And 12 years down the track, it's just amazing. Like it's literally a dream come true to have done this work. And just the idea of using work as an intentional relationship building tool, it just changes what work means, and it changes the way, and just having a group of friends that we've done some stuff with and that I know, and hey, so I'm on sabbatical next year too. I'm quitting Dev Academy and I'm out of leadership in January and I'm out of management or out of teaching in April. So it's like, it's just the opportunities and what I look forward to in the next 10 years is just deeply exciting. And so I think just the people is all me.
What about you, Kate?
I'm really in the facilitator mode. Echoing those sentiments, that I've learned that, yeah, with people who really see you and understand you, you can do somersaults really, and you can develop in a way that the old you never thought was possible. And that is really being given a lifeline. So yeah, there we are. We're at the end of this lovely panel, this beautiful discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Ants Cabraal, who has organized this wonderful event. And thanks to everyone helping. And yeah, thanks to the audience for coming and giving such good energy.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Making Joshua cry was one of our key metrics of success, so we did that.
It wouldn't be a conference without it.
All right. And on that note, there's another session starting in a few minutes. So have a stretch break and we'll see you at the next one.